Hey guys, I wanted to take a moment to address something that keeps coming up over and over again in my interactions with Roman Catholics, particularly in an apologetic setting. And I don't mean internet disputes or anything like that, but really high level conversations where we're really trying to dialogue. And what I've noticed is there's often a fundamental misunderstanding in a very specific argument that I'm making, and that other Orthodox make, that are just misunderstood by Roman Catholics. So I wanted to clarify what that argument actually is and what it is not. So generally with these apologetic conversations, it always goes, at least for me, in a particular sequence. So, I make a claim or they make a claim, and then we both kind of marshal all of our patristic citations that seem to hold up our claims. And that largely doesn't end anywhere. I think that's important as a preliminary thing to do, particularly when you're researching a topic, but that's not how you settle an issue. You settle an issue by both sides have to come up with a historical narrative that makes sense of all the evidence, and then you just have to weigh, which historical reading does that successfully. I believe the Orthodox reading does, and Roman Catholics believe the Roman Catholic narrative does. So we tend to get to a stalemate there, and I actually think part of the reason we get into a stalemate is because that the fathers were a lot more univocal than we give them credit for. The differences between them sometimes are so subtle, and the history is so hard to parse out, that way of doing apologetics tends to be very labor intensive. It requires a lot of research, maybe more research than I'm willing to give or my interlocutors are willing to give. I've researched very particular aspects of patristic thought, but I'm just not going to go through the rudder and read all of the canons of the ecumenical councils. Someone else can do that work. Okay. So what I usually do is deploy a very different argument. And that argument is, look, we're not going to settle this by quote mining the first 1,000 years. What I point to is, what about the second 1,000 years? The fact that the Orthodox Church has largely preserved and retained the theology, liturgy, the basic ethos of the first 1,000 years, but the West has gone through dramatic shifts, theologically, liturgically, ethically, juridically, just how the church functions. That's my argument. My argument is that if I compare the church of the second millennium even to the church of the first millennium, even those fathers that my Roman Catholic interlocutors are citing, they're not really reconcilable. And it's not just a matter of a difference of form. It's really a difference of substance. I don't care about the difference of form. If you want to translate this idea into, kind of scholastic syllogisms or use some modern philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology, I don't actually care. I can track with that. I'm used to thinking in different conceptual paradigms, but revolving around the same ideas. What I'm saying is the ideas actually changed, not just the packaging. And invariably, when I deploy that argument, I always get the same response, and that is the development of doctrine argument. And I think I understand why this is. So Roman Catholics, they're used to this kind of argument, but they're used to it coming from Protestants. They're used to a Protestant apologetic that says something like this, and this is an oversimplification, but the Protestant argument is that we had this, pristine biblical experience. Before St. John of Patmos, completed the book of the Apocalypse, we had this really primitive, this pristine primitivism. And that everything after that is sort of a degeneration of that pristine sort of moment. So Protestants will also often argue that let's go back to that pristine primitivism. And Roman Catholics, I believe, rather reasonably argue for development of doctrine, of saying, no, there's nothing in the Bible that would lead us to believe that after the death of the last apostle, that the church would cease to figure out what the gospel is all about. And I find the notion that, the gospel, or at least access to the true understanding of the gospel, would cease relatively short after the last apostle is just... it's just a silly idea. Like, we must believe in different gods. Like, I don't believe the gospel went dark until Martin Luther kind of rediscovered it. So I understand why Roman Catholics point to development of doctrine against that Protestant critique. But that's not what I'm saying. So largely, I accept the idea of development of doctrine, though I do have very specific problems with Newman in particular and how Newman deployed what he did. I think he has certain blinders and certain projects that he's trying to accomplish that skew how he presents development of doctrine. But overall, I think it's a fine theory. And if you boil down the theory to, the church moves into different contexts, different questions are being asked, different challenges raised, that the doctrine once and for all delivered to the saints, that the one truth of the faith has to meet these new situations. If that's what you mean by development, fine. I think I could actually argue that Newman goes beyond that, and that's where we have issues. But that argument in and of itself, great. But that's, again, not what I'm saying. So I think what Roman Catholics hear in that Orthodox challenge of saying, whoa, there was a major shift that happened in all kinds of different areas in the church after that first millennium, they think we're making a Protestant-like argument of saying, okay, not just the Bible, but the Bible plus the church fathers. Those are our magical, pristine, primitive purity, that anything beyond is a degradation, anything beyond is an invalid innovation. But that's not my argument, okay? So my argument is actually that the fathers very importantly, very accurately engaged in doctrinal development, and they developed their theology in a very, very sophisticated way. But what I find in Western theology is constantly, it's not progressive, but it's actually retrogressive. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Dr. Peter Brown, really famous historian of late antiquity, wrote this massive biography of St. Augustine. And it's really worth reading. It's everything by Dr. Peter Brown is worth reading. But he notes something in there that, and this was the first time I ever heard or read a scholar noting this, and I went, that's it. That's exactly what I've been, thinking about. And he basically says this, that if you read Augustine, he reads in a lot of his theology more like Origen or Tertullian than he does the Cappadocian Fathers. He actually reads as a generation behind what was going on in the East. Why is that? And Dr. Brown lays out a perfectly coherent argument. It's because he only had access to the Neoplatonic text that the Cappadocian Fathers were also working from, but he didn't have access to the Cappadocian Fathers themselves. So he winds up falling into a lot of the basic mistakes of trying to appropriate Neoplatonism that the Cappadocian Fathers are fixing and correcting and not falling into. And later on, you'll have to have St. Maximus further, weed out some of these problems. In the new translations of St. Maximus's Ambigua, I think Father Maximus, who translated, even points that out, that he's finishing a project started by the Cappadocian Fathers. But basically what I'm saying is that Augustine, even though he was quite brilliant, he was falling into some of these basic mistakes, trying to map on Trinitarian theology directly on Neoplatonic triad metaphysics, or not critiquing well enough absolute divine simplicity, as the Cappadocian Fathers did in their Trinitarian theology, locating the unity of God in the person of the Father, which is the Cappadocians did with the doctrine of the monarchy of the Father, rather than a generic unity of divine nature, as Augustine did, and they would lead to very different Trinitarian theologies, East and West. But the basic point is that Augustine is not progressive. He's not developing beyond what the Cappadocian Fathers did. He's actually, even though he's writing after, he's prior intellectually almost to the Cappadocian Fathers and falling into some of the basic mistakes that they avoid and later Eastern Fathers even further correct. And I think that's what happened with Aquinas. So I know this is not going to go over well with my Roman Catholic friends, but I do like Thomas Aquinas. I've read Thomas Aquinas. I particularly like I actually like the second half of the Summa better than the first part. But Thomas Aquinas is a very all the accolades that he gets, it's well deserved. But I read Thomas Aquinas at the same time that I was reading a lot of Neo-Thomists, Etienne Gosson and Jacques Maritain. But also at the same time I was reading Byzantine scholastics, St. Maximus the Confessor in particular, and a lot of the literature around Maximus the Confessor. And what I noticed is that what Thomas is doing isn't any more intellectually sophisticated than what John of Damascus is doing or what Maximus the Confessor is doing. So and why I say that is there's this perception in Roman Catholicism, and I actually first came across this idea from a book, it was by Thomas Merton of all people, his book on Gregory of Nyssa. And Thomas Merton kind of lays out an idea that I actually found shocking because I'd never heard this before, but I've come to discover that this is a common idea in Roman Catholicism. And the idea goes something like this, that in the Fathers, things are very vague, things are very contradictory, there's not a lot of sophistication of thought, and basically what Thomas does, or what scholasticism does, is smooths out all those contradictions and puts patristic theology into a very highly coherent system. Okay, so he improves upon the Fathers. But even in that same text, Thomas Merton is talking about how this is the first time he's actually reading Gregory of Nyssa. He doesn't even mention, as far as I remember, St. Maximus the Confessor. So what's going on here? What I actually believe happened is that Aquinas was this super intellect that he is lauded for being, but his actual knowledge of the patristic tradition was rather limited, and we know that by what he cites and what he doesn't. He cites a lot of Dionysius, he cites much of the Cappadocians, and he cites really wonderfully even almost contemporary Byzantine sources, particularly on biblical interpretation. So in some ways, and I'm sort of lifting this from an insight from Hans Urs von Balthasar on his book on Maximus. He has a whole chapter on Aquinas, ironically. But what he talks about is, in many ways, Aquinas is the most Eastern of the Western Fathers. He's the most well-read and sympathetic to patristic Greek thought. But I think there's some huge blinders on Thomas Aquinas that he doesn't know is there, and it's mostly just because of textual ignorance, that he's getting bits and pieces of the patristic tradition, but not a whole lot of Maximus the Confessor. But also what I think the blinders are with Aquinas is what he's doing is he's trying to systematize the Fathers, but he's trying to systematize them in completing a Neoplatonic project. He's recovering Aristotle, but he's recovering Aristotle in a very Islamified fashion, in a style of Aristotle that's already trying to reintegrate him back into the Platonic tradition. And he's obviously highly influenced by St. Augustine, who, like I mentioned before, is coming from a very Neoplatonic perspective. So Aquinas is trying to do something very specific, and I don't think that he's smoothing out contradictions in the Fathers. I think he's packaging the Fathers in order to complete a philosophical project of a rapprochement between Christianity and Neoplatonism, whereas the Fathers, particularly the Cappadocian Fathers and St. Maximus, are doing something fundamentally different. They're not trying to do that. They're not trying to reconcile Christianity with Neoplatonism. What they're actually doing is fundamentally retooling, transforming from the ground level Neoplatonism into something that is compatible as a conceptual framework in order to talk about the mysteries of the Christian religion. Because you have to understand all of the ecumenical councils, the 7 first ecumenical councils and the theological disputes, those are mostly happening in the East, and they're mostly caused by misusing or misappropriating or uncritically adopting Hellenic philosophy and trying to just pass it off as Christianity. So what the Fathers are doing is something very, very fundamental, where I think that was almost completely lost. It just went over Thomas's head because that's not the project he was interested in. He wasn't dialoguing and trying to fight with Neoplatonists or Christian theologians who are misusing Neoplatonism. He was trying to recover that tradition. It was a dead thing. He wasn't arguing against it. He was trying to put it back together to revive a philosophical tradition in the West. So the fundamental agendas were just different. So I believe that rather than progressing on the Fathers, what we actually see in scholasticism is a progressing on a Neoplatonic, Hellenistic intellectual project. Thomas does advance upon, and I'll just say it, he does advance upon Aristotle. He clears things up that Aristotle didn't quite know how to fit. He gets rid of certain things that Plotinus was trying to do and puts in a much more cohesive philosophical system. So he does progress on what came before, but he doesn't progress on the Fathers. I actually think he distorts the Fathers to fit into his intellectual project. So that's what I'm trying to say. And I know that's sort of a very detailed analysis of what I'm trying to say, but my basic argument is not against development of doctrine, is not even against the idea that theology can become more sophisticated. It's that Thomas is not that. He's not making the theology more sophisticated. He's actually falling into basic fundamental misunderstandings that the Greek Fathers identified and went around. One being negative theology. So we do find the Via Negativa most famously in part 1 of the Summa, but I actually think Aquinas is misunderstanding what Dionysius meant by that. So Dionysius, or for Aquinas, Via Negativa is basically a semantic a priori. It's just oh yes, this ideas about God will never fit in our mind, therefore we are using pure analogy. That's not what Dionysius said. What Dionysius said is that we can make positive statements, but every time we make a positive statement, we have to understand that can't be equated to God, so then we make negative statements. But then at the end of his mystical theology, he even goes beyond that and says every time we make negative statements, it's just a positive statement in reverse. So they're both the same. And what he says is that we actually go through this cycle of affirmation and negation, affirmation and negation. And in that confluence, we're encountering God not in either of those statements, but in his divine energies, in his presence and activity in us. That's what Dionysius was saying. That's where the Fathers took negative theology. But in Aquinas, it's just an a priori statement that leads to a purely analogical theology that I think is quite different than what the Fathers were actually saying. But again, that goes right over his head. He doesn't seem to understand the implications. And I'm not saying that I'm smarter or the Eastern Fathers were smarter than Thomas Aquinas, but remember what he was trying to do. He was trying to revive a whole tradition of thinking about God, and the sophistication that the Greek fathers had of this confluence of positive and negative affirmations, that just didn't fit into his project. He was trying to get people to talk about theology again, not get into like the summit of the mountain. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is the whole, following Augustine on a very basic misunderstanding of absolute divine simplicity. And that's what we get in Thomas in the Summa contra Gentiles, against the Gentiles. He's basically arguing for a God where his Trinitarian nature is something accidental almost. It's an add-on. It doesn't fundamentally change how he talks about God. He kind of has to reintegrate a Trinitarian understanding into his much more Hellenistic understanding of who God is, where you can't do that with the Cappadocians. You really can't, because you look at someone like St. Basil the Great. With the monarchy of the Father, the unifying principle of the Godhead is not the unity of the divine nature. It's the unity of the divine nature insofar as each person comes from the person of the Father. See what I'm saying? So you can never get a non-Trinitarian monotheism in the Cappadocian Fathers, where you can get a non-Trinitarian monotheism in Thomas Aquinas. Okay. So that's my argument. My argument is not I'm poo-pooing development. My argument is that Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics after him and the modernists after them were making fundamental philosophical and theological mistakes that were actually retrogressive. And I don't think it's because they were dumb. I think it's because of a breakdown of communication. They didn't necessarily understand what the fathers were saying, why they were saying it, because the scholarship obviously was not there, but the texts themselves were not there. Literacy of Greek was not there. The translations hadn't been made. So that's my argument. I think Roman Catholics kind of get surprised. I did when I was a Catholic, surprised at the sophistication of modern patristic scholarship and Orthodox theology, and we're not making the argument that we need to get back to some theoretical primitive purity. Our argument is that because of the breakdown of communication, because scholasticism was interested fundamentally in a different project, the project of completing Hellenistic philosophy, rather than a project of transforming Hellenistic thought into Christian theology. Those are two different projects. That's the argument, that something fundamentally changed in the doctrine itself. So when I see further Roman Catholic developments, I don't really even see them as developments. I see them as a retrogression that launched a completely contrary trajectory as to where the church of the first 1,000 years was developing these doctrines. So I really do see it as a split in the God whom we are confessing and ultimately the mysteries of faith that we celebrate. So I hope that's helpful. I know those are, this can be an intellectual leap, but I think we need to move beyond getting fights over development of doctrine and really getting to, okay, what are we actually saying about God? And that's my argument, is that the scholastic thinkers can't ultimately be reconciled with the Cappadocians. The modern Roman Catholic theology can't be reconciled with something like Trent. Trent itself can't be reconciled perhaps with theology before. So my argument isn't that the church should never change. My argument is that radical discontinuity should tell you something.